Jax's revenge domain.
Before this story begins, let me ask you something. Have you ever been told your 22 years of experience is legacy thinking that's holding the company back? That happened to me on a Tuesday morning in a glass conference room that cost more than my annual salary. I'm James Holloway, 55 years old, and I've been protecting corporate networks since most people thought the internet was something you caught fish with. The meeting started normal enough. I walked in carrying a folder thick with security reports, breach analyses, and compliance documentation. 22 years of preventing disasters that never made headlines because they never happened. My boss, Brandon Pierce, all of 35 years old with his Stanford MBA and Silicon Valley swagger, smiled that practice smile they teach you in business school. "Jim," he said, leaning back in his chair like he owned the world, "let's talk about your compensation review. I'd requested a 12% raise. Not unreasonable for someone who'd built their entire security infrastructure from scratch. Not crazy for someone who'd prevented 3 major breach attempts in the past year alone. But Brandon had other ideas. The thing is, he continued, we're moving toward a more agile security model. AI-driven threat detection, automated response systems. The board feels we need to invest in next-generation solutions rather than legacy approaches. Legacy approaches. That's what he called 22 years of keeping their data safe. He explained how the company needed to modernize its thinking. How my methodical approach to security protocols was slowing down innovation. How they couldn't justify higher compensation for what AI could do faster and cheaper. Then came the kicker. He suggested I consider transitioning to an advisory role or maybe exploring early retirement options. Said it with that same smile like he was doing me a favor. I sat there listening to this kid who'd never dealt with a real security crisis explain why my experience was outdated. This was the same guy who'd asked me last month why we couldn't just download more antivirus when our perimeter defenses flagged a sophisticated attack. I appreciate the feedback, I told him. That's all. No arguments, no pushback. I collected my folder and walked out, but something had shifted inside me. For 22 years, I'd been the guy who stayed late to patch vulnerabilities, who answered calls at 3 a.m. when alerts went off, who wrote detailed reports that nobody read until something went wrong. I'd been invisible because I'd made security look easy. Back at my desk, I stared at the screen without really seeing it. The network monitoring dashboard showed everything running smooth. Green lights across the board. 0 incidents, 0 downtime, 0 headlines. All because I'd spent years building systems that worked even when people made mistakes. Around me, the office hummed with its usual energy. Keyboards clicking, phones buzzing, conversations about agile sprints and disruptive innovation. The same words Brandon had thrown at me like weapons. To everyone else, it was just another workday. To me, something had already ended. I opened that folder again, page after page of threat assessments, vulnerability reports, compliance audits, evidence of problems I'd stopped before they became catastrophes. Numbers that meant nothing to people who measured success by how fast you could ship features, not by how well you protected what you'd already built. My phone lit up with another alert. Minor anomaly in external traffic patterns. The kind of thing I usually handled in minutes, just routine maintenance of the digital walls that kept the company safe. This time, I stared at the notification for a long moment before addressing it that afternoon. I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened my personal laptop and scrolled through old messages. Buried in my inbox was an email from Rebecca Torres, CISO at CyberShield Consulting. She'd reached out 6 months ago asking if I'd ever consider making a move. I'd ignored it then, loyalty keeping me tied to a company that apparently saw that loyalty as weakness. This time I replied. Her response came back within an hour. Professional but warm. Could we set up a call? Nothing formal, just a conversation between 2 security professionals who understood what the job really meant. The call was different from any conversation I'd had at work in months. Rebecca didn't ask about my age or whether I could keep up with modern threats. She asked about the breach attempts I'd stopped, the compliance frameworks I'd built, the protocols that had kept her competitors' data out of criminal hands. "We need someone who understands that security isn't about moving fast and breaking things," she said during our video call. "It's about understanding that when things break in our business, people get hurt." She talked about CyberShield's approach, how they valued institutional knowledge, how they understood that the most sophisticated attacks often used old techniques that young analysts had never seen before, how experience wasn't overhead, it was their competitive advantage. When she mentioned compensation, the numbers were 40% higher than anything I'd ever earned. But what mattered more was what came after the money. Real authority to build teams and set policies, a title that meant something. Senior Director of Security Architecture. Most importantly, she offered something Brandon never had: respect for what experience actually means. I didn't accept immediately. 22 years of habit told me to think it through, to consider all angles. But sitting at my kitchen table that night with my wife Linda, the decision felt obvious. They don't see what you prevent, Linda said, stirring her coffee slowly. They only see what they pay for. She was right. Nobody gets promoted for disasters that don't happen. I submitted my resignation the next morning. 2 weeks notice, professional and clean. No drama, no accusations, just a simple letter stating my last day would be Friday, November 15th. I walked it to HR myself and handed it to Sarah Martinez, who'd processed my benefits for the last 8 years. Jim, what's this about? She asked, scanning the letter with genuine surprise. Time for a change, I said. Nothing personal. Word spread fast in our open office layout. By lunch, Brandon had called an emergency meeting. Same glass conference room, same expensive furniture, but now his swagger looked forced. This is unexpected. He started like my resignation was some kind of natural disaster. We really need to discuss transition planning. Transition planning. 22 years of institutional knowledge, and now they wanted it documented in 2 weeks. What would it take to reconsider? He asked, leaning forward with sudden interest. We could revisit the compensation discussion. Too late for that. Respect offered under pressure isn't respect. I'm committed to helping with the handover, I said. Gary Walsh seems like the logical choice to take over the core responsibilities. Gary was solid. 45 years old, understood networks, had been with the company for 7 years, but he'd never built a security framework from scratch. He'd never lived through a major attack or testified before regulators about compliance failures. The next 2 weeks felt surreal. I documented everything I could, but 22 years of experience doesn't transfer in 320 hours. Some knowledge lives in your head, earned through late nights and crisis responses and learning from mistakes nobody else remembers. Gary absorbed what he could. He asked good questions, took careful notes, stayed late to understand the monitoring systems I'd built, but I could see the weight settling on him. The realization that he was inheriting responsibility for systems he hadn't designed, protocols he hadn't tested, relationships with vendors he'd never managed. The threat landscape is changing so fast, he said during one of our handover sessions. How do you keep up with everything? You don't keep up, I told him. You stay ahead. You assume every system will be attacked, every user will make mistakes, every vendor will eventually disappoint you, then you build accordingly. He nodded, but I could tell the philosophy felt overwhelming. It takes years to develop that kind of defensive mindset. You can't download it with the documentation. On my last day, I cleaned out my desk while the office buzzed with its usual energy. Same conversations about sprint goals and user engagement metrics, same confidence that everything would continue running smoothly. They had no idea that the safety net was about to disappear. Brandon made a point of stopping by my desk for a public goodbye. Firm handshake, professional smile, wishes for future success. The whole performance felt hollow, but I played my part. Don't be a stranger, he said. We might have consulting opportunities down the road. I nodded politely and didn't mention that I'd already signed an offer letter with CyberShield. My first month at my new company was like stepping into sunlight after years underground. Rebecca's team asked questions instead of demanding quick fixes. They planned for worst-case scenarios instead of hoping for the best. When I proposed comprehensive security audits for new clients, nobody asked how much it would cost or how long it would take. They asked how thorough it would be. The work was challenging in ways I'd forgotten were possible. Real problems with complex solutions. Clients who understood that security wasn't a feature you added at the end, but a foundation you built from the ground up. Meanwhile, news from my old company started trickling in through former colleagues. Gary was doing his best, but the learning curve was steep. Network performance issues that used to get resolved in minutes now took hours. Compliance reports that I generated automatically now required manual research and review. Nothing catastrophic, just friction, the kind that slows everything down without anyone understanding why. 3 weeks into my new job, Gary called me on a Saturday morning. His voice carried stress I recognized from my own early years. Jim, we're seeing unusual traffic patterns. Looks like somebody's probing our external interfaces. I've implemented basic countermeasures, but I'm not sure what else to look for. I could hear keyboards clicking in the background, multiple people working on a weekend. The kind of all-hands response that happens when something feels bigger than routine maintenance. What's the pattern, I asked. Systematic port scanning, but slow. Almost like they're trying not to trigger our automated defenses, and they're coming from multiple IP ranges that seem unrelated. Classic reconnaissance. The kind of patient, methodical probing that precedes sophisticated attacks. I'd seen it dozens of times, always followed by more serious attempts. Have you escalated to Brandon, he says, to handle it internally? Doesn't want to alarm the board unless it's a confirmed threat. Classic Brandon. Don't report problems until they become disasters. I talked Gary through immediate steps to document the intrusion attempts, how to trace the traffic patterns, what signatures to look for in the logs. But I could tell he was overwhelmed. He was trying to handle a chess match with checkers experience. Should I bring in outside consultants? He asked. That's above my pay grade now, I said, but document everything. Timestamps, IP addresses, attack vectors, whatever happens next, you'll want that paper trail. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and thought about that conversation. Part of me felt bad for Gary. He was a good guy caught in a situation nobody had prepared him for, but another part of me felt vindicated. The problems I'd warned about for years were finally becoming visible. Linda found me staring out the window an hour later. Work calling on weekends already? She asked. Old work, I said. They're having some security issues. She poured her own coffee and sat across from me. You're not thinking about helping them, are you? No, I said. That bridge is burned. But I feel bad for Gary. Gary didn't make the decision to push you out, Linda reminded me. He's just dealing with the consequences. She was right. The people who'd created this situation were the same ones who'd refused to invest in proper security infrastructure, who'd treated institutional knowledge like an expense instead of an asset. 2 weeks later, the real attack began. The news broke on a Wednesday morning. I was reviewing security assessments for a new client when Rebecca knocked on my office door, her face grim. Jim, you need to see this, she said, holding up her tablet. Your old company just announced a major data breach. The headline hit like a punch to the gut. Manufacturing giant suffers massive cyber attack. Millions of customer records compromised. Below it, a photo of the corporate headquarters I'd walked out of just 6 weeks earlier. I read the details with growing recognition. The attackers had exploited exactly the vulnerabilities I'd identified in my final security assessment. The same weaknesses I'd flagged as critical risks requiring immediate attention. The same report Brandon had marked as low priority because fixing those issues would have required significant infrastructure investment. Customer data, financial records, intellectual property, employee information. Everything I'd spent 22 years protecting was now in the hands of criminals who'd sell it to the highest bidder. The financial damage was staggering. Initial estimates put the immediate response costs at $203 million, but that was just the beginning. Lawsuits were already being filed. Regulatory investigations launched. The company's stock price dropped 67% in 2 days. But what really caught my attention was buried in the third paragraph of the news coverage. The attack had started with the exact reconnaissance Gary had called me about. Those unusual traffic patterns had been the opening moves in a sophisticated campaign that took weeks to execute. Gary called me that afternoon. He sounded exhausted, defeated. They're bringing in the FBI, he said, and forensic consultants from 3 different firms. Everyone wants to know how this happened, how we missed it. Did you show them your incident logs from last month? I asked. That's the thing, Jim. Management is saying we should have escalated sooner, that we should have recognized the threat level. Brandon keeps asking why our security protocols didn't catch this. I almost laughed at the irony. The same protocols Brandon had wanted to replace with AI were now being questioned for not preventing an attack that human expertise might have stopped. What are the consultants saying? They want to review all our security documentation going back 2 years. They're particularly interested in recent staff changes and whether any institutional knowledge was lost during transitions. There it was. The question I'd been waiting for someone to ask. Gary, you need to preserve those incident reports from October. Timestamps everything, document every escalation request and management response. This is going to get ugly and you don't want to be holding the blame. 3 days later, I received a call I'd been expecting but dreading, federal subpoena. The Congressional Subcommittee on Cybersecurity wanted to understand how a preventable breach had compromised millions of Americans' personal data. The hearing was scheduled for December 15th. Senator Patricia Warren's office made it clear they were particularly interested in the timeline of events leading up to the breach, including any warnings that might have been ignored by corporate leadership. I spent the next week preparing my testimony with CyberShield's legal team. The facts were straightforward, but the implications were explosive. Email records subpoenaed during the FBI investigation showed my final security assessment, marked as low priority by Brandon just 3 months before the exact vulnerabilities I'd identified were exploited. The hearing room was intimidating. Marble columns, mahogany panels, senators with serious expressions and cameras recording every word. I'd testified before regulatory agencies about compliance issues, but never before Congress about a national security incident. Senator Warren led the questioning. Mr. Holloway, you served as Director of IT Security at the affected company for how long? 22 years, Senator. And in your final security assessment, did you identify the vulnerabilities that were exploited in this attack? Yes, ma'am. The attack vector was specifically outlined in my September report as a critical risk requiring immediate attention. She held up a printed email. According to documents provided by your former employer, this assessment was marked as low priority by executive leadership. Can you explain what that typically means in a corporate security context? Senator, it means the identified risks were acknowledged but not considered urgent enough to allocate budget or resources for remediation. In your professional opinion, would addressing these vulnerabilities have prevented this breach? Yes, Senator. The specific attack relied entirely on the unpatched systems and outdated protocols I'd fagged for replacement. The room was dead quiet. You could hear photographers adjusting their cameras. Mr. Holloway, you left your position at this company approximately 6 weeks before the breach occurred. Was your departure related to disagreements over security priorities? This was the question that mattered. The one that would determine whether this hearing was about corporate negligence or simple bad luck. Senator, I requested a compensation adjustment that was denied. During that discussion, I was told that my methodical approach to security was inconsistent with the company's desire to move faster and more aggressively. I was advised to consider early retirement. Were you told specifically that your security protocols were slowing down business operations? Yes, Senator. I was told that AI-driven security solutions would be more efficient and cost-effective than human expertise. Senator Warren leaned forward. To be clear, Mr. Holloway, you were essentially told that your 22 years of experience was obsolete. That's correct, Senator. The hearing continued for 3 hours. Other witnesses included Gary, who did his best to explain the timeline of events, and Brandon, who spent most of his time deflecting responsibility and talking about the company's commitment to cybersecurity investment. When Brandon was asked about my security assessment being marked low priority, he claimed it was part of a broader strategic review of infrastructure investments. When pressed about whether cost considerations had influenced security decisions, he fell back on prepared talking points about balancing multiple business priorities. The contrast was stark. Gary and I provided specific technical details, timestamps, and documented evidence. Brandon offered corporate speak and deflection. After my testimony, I walked out of the hearing room, feeling something I hadn't expected. Relief. For 22 years, I'd written reports and raised concerns and watched them disappear into management chains that prioritized quarterly earnings over long-term security. Now, finally, someone was asking the right questions. The media coverage was immediate and brutal. Not because of political drama, but because it highlighted something most Americans were starting to understand: the real cost of treating cybersecurity as an expense rather than an investment. Brandon was fired 2 weeks after my testimony. The board brought in a new CEO with an actual technology background, someone who understood that security wasn't a feature you added at the end, but a foundation you built from the ground up. Gary left the company within a month, burned out from trying to rebuild what should never have been torn down. Last I heard, he took a position with a smaller firm that valued his experience over his ability to work 80-hour weeks cleaning up other people's mistakes. The lawsuits kept coming. Class action suits from customers whose data had been stolen. Shareholder suits claiming the board had failed in their fiduciary duty to protect company assets. Regulatory fines from the FTC that made the initial $2,003 million response cost look like pocket change. Meanwhile, my role at CyberShield expanded in ways I couldn't have imagined. Rebecca promoted me to Chief Security Officer and gave me a team of 12 analysts. We specialized in helping companies that had learned the hard way that security wasn't negotiable. The irony wasn't lost on me. My old company became one of our case studies in how not to handle cybersecurity. Their breach was textbook example of what happens when leadership confuses speed with efficiency, innovation with recklessness. 6 months after the Congressional hearing, I received recognition I'd never expected. The National Institute of Standards and Technology invited me to join an advisory panel on cybersecurity workforce development. Apparently, my story had resonated with lawmakers concerned about the graying of cybersecurity expertise. The panel's mission was straightforward: figure out how to keep experienced professionals in the field instead of pushing them toward early retirement. Turns out, I wasn't the only one who'd been told their decades of experience were legacy thinking. During our first meeting in Washington, I met others with similar stories. A former NSA analyst who'd been right-sized for questioning cloud migration timelines. A financial services security director who'd been replaced by an AI system that lasted exactly 3 months before being supplemented by human expertise again. All of us had stories about being undervalued right up until the moment our expertise became desperately needed. The work was gratifying in a way I hadn't experienced in corporate America. We weren't just creating policies. We were changing how organizations thought about experience in rapidly evolving fields. Our recommendations became part of federal cybersecurity guidelines, emphasizing the irreplaceable value of institutional knowledge and crisis experience. A year after leaving my old company, I was invited to speak at the RSA conference, the biggest cybersecurity gathering in North America. The keynote topic: why gray hair matters in information security. Standing on that stage looking out at 5,000 security professionals, I thought about Brandon's conference room and his dismissive talk about legacy thinking. The audience was full of people like me, veterans who'd seen attacks evolve, who'd learned to think like adversaries, who understood that the most sophisticated threat isn't always the newest one. Technology changes fast, I told them, but attackers don't. They use the same social engineering, the same patience, the same understanding of human weakness they've always used. The tools evolve, but the fundamentals remain constant. That's not legacy thinking, that's wisdom. The applause was genuine, but what mattered more were the conversations afterward. Young analysts asking about career development, mid-career professionals wondering how to position their growing experience, senior people sharing stories about being modernized out of organizations they'd served faithfully for decades. I realized that my story wasn't unique. It was representative of something happening across corporate America. The systematic devaluation of experience in favor of speed, innovation, and cost-cutting. 3 months ago, I got a call from an unexpected source. Admiral Charles Brennan, the new board chairman at my former company, wanted to discuss bringing me back as a consultant to rebuild their security program. I listened to his pitch. Substantial consulting fees, complete authority over security architecture, direct reporting to the board instead of through executive management. Everything that had been impossible when I was an employee was suddenly available as a contractor. We've learned some hard lessons, the Admiral said. The board realizes now that security isn't a technology problem. It's a leadership problem. We need someone who understands both the technical and business implications of our decisions. I declined politely, not because the offer wasn't generous, but because some lessons can only be learned through experience. They needed to rebuild their security culture from scratch, with leaders who understood its value before crisis forced the education. Besides, I had more important work to do, real work with people who understood that cybersecurity is like a levee system. Nobody notices when it's working perfectly, but when it fails, everyone demands to know why the engineers didn't prevent the flood. The National Security Agency reached out last month. They're developing new guidelines for critical infrastructure protection and want industry veterans on the advisory committee. The appointment comes with security clearance and direct input into policies that will protect power grids, financial systems, and communication networks. It's the kind of recognition that takes a career to earn. The irony is that I'm getting it now, at 56, precisely because I refused to accept that experience was obsolete. Looking back, I understand what really happened in that glass conference room. Brandon didn't just deny me a raise. He revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that defines too much of modern corporate culture, the belief that experience is cost, not investment. They learned otherwise. It just cost them their reputation, their customers' trust, and congressional oversight to get the education. If you're listening to this and you recognize the pattern, understand something important. Your experience isn't outdated because technology advances. Your judgment, your crisis management skills, your understanding of how systems fail under pressure, none of that becomes obsolete just because someone invents a newer tool. Don't let anyone convince you that wisdom is weakness. Document your work, know your worth. Don't confuse loyalty with invisibility, because when the real test comes, organizations don't ask for the cheapest solution or the fastest implementation. They ask for someone who's seen it all before and knows how to make it stop. Experience isn't legacy thinking. It's the difference between surviving the next crisis and becoming a cautionary tale about what happens when you mistake speed for strength.